Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Many of you know that the presumed start date of the Mayan calendar was the year 3114 BC, a date which not everybody agrees with specifically, but one that was certainly of huge significance worldwide. It is around that time when the magnificent Newgrange megalithic site was built in Ireland. When the first phase of Stonehenge was constructed, the date when Narmer or Menes is presumed to have unified Upper and Lower Egypt, and also the time when the civilization of Sumer had a major downfall, before a new king took control and caused the country to blossom into the empire we now know so much about. The period of time between 3500 and 3000 BC seems to be significant around the world. It was a time of great change, and it didn't just affect human civilizations, but the planet as a whole. There was a major sulfate concentration in Greenland ice in 3200 BC. The Dead Sea rose 300 feet around the same time. Oxygen isotopes suggest intense volcanic activity around 3150 BC, and tree ring data from Ireland shows there was a major climatic event. Heavy flooding in the American Southwest peaked around the same time. There was an arid interval in Morocco, as well as the onset of desertification across North Africa, and there is also evidence of cooler sea temperatures in the North Atlantic. Something major happened on Earth at this time, and we know from how human civilization was affected, it was a major turning point in history too. Few records survive to give us details about specific events that occurred at this time, but it is arguably the most important and decisive time in history since the Younger Dryas event. Most textbooks talk about history beginning around 3100 BC. It is presented to the masses like hunter-gatherers down their spears for the first time and began farming, building communities, and starting civilizations. But the amazing megalithic site of Göbekli Tepe is just one example of why this short-sighted interpretation of human development is wrong. History didn't begin at 3100 BC, but instead, this was a time of transition, and the changes that took place laid the foundations for the history we now know so much, but really so little about. The end of this global upheaval roughly corresponds to the time attributed to the early dynasty period of the Sumerians, when all the traits of an organised civilization seem to appear in a short space of time. Metalwork, astronomy, calendar systems, taxation, bookkeeping, organised religion, the invention of the wheel, and so on. The first texts were also presumably written around 3100 BC. They also recorded numbers and ideographs, an apparently sudden change from the old pictographs. The king known as Etana of Kish is noted as he who stabilised the lands. His is the first name on the Sumerian king list, a cuneiform document written by a scribe of the city of Lagash in 2100 BC. In Egypt, the first dynastic king, Narmer or Menes, unified Upper and Lower Egypt at around 3100 BC, the same date produced from organic material taken from between megalithic blocks of the Great Pyramid, and one which falls within the error margins of the dating of the famous solar boat buried on the southern side of the pyramid. Is this when the Great Pyramid was really built? In Britain, the first phase of Stonehenge began between 3100 and 3000 BC. The magnificent stones of Stennis, a great stone circle in the Orkney Isles, was also erected, and in Ireland, the fantastic Newgrange was built. In China, civilization is said to have begun at the same time, with the emergence of the Yangshao culture. Although some disagree with this date, radiocarbon dating of Yangshao pottery dates to 3100 BC, plus or minus 100 years. It is around this date that specific types of pottery are found along the Pacific coast in Ecuador, South America, a style that closely resembles Japanese pottery of the same period. In ancient India, the first age, called the Kali Yuga, is said to have begun in 3102 BC, a calendar thought to be based on the precessional cycle, much like that of the Maya, whose long count calendar began just 12 years earlier in 3114 BC. Humans had been around for a long time before this period in question, and they're still going strong now, but the period of time between 3200 and 3000 BC is unquestionably of extreme importance in our history. Yet it is often overlooked and mistaken as a beginning date, and not a transition date, which it clearly was. So, just what did happen? One possibility that some scientists believe could have happened is that some 5,000 years ago, the Earth passed through the core of a swarm of meteors created by a collapsed comet. In this kind of scenario, showers of meteors, visible even in daylight, could have struck the Earth at a specific time each year for many years in a row. Such a phenomena would cause chaos and destruction, a disturbing phenomenon, especially psychologically for humans everywhere. Ancient civilizations may well have built large architectural projects at this time as a way to observe and explain what they were seeing, as well as to create solutions to the problems they would encounter annually. Due to the climatic as well as the physical effects of the meteor swarm, many people would have to migrate to different parts of the globe, to rebuild their civilization and to start afresh, or to amalgamate with other cultures. Many ancient texts refer to fiery chariots and explosions in the night sky, obvious natural phenomena that some explain as being ancient nuclear wars from our astronaut ancestors, when the most likely explanation is the simplest. It was an annual meteor swarm from a fragmented comet. The likely culprit is the swarm we still experience today in the 21st century, but instead of destruction, we are treated with an annual shooting star display as small meteors get burnt up in the Earth's atmosphere. This is, of course, the Taurid meteor shower, associated with the comet Enki. They are named after their radiant point in the constellation of Taurus the Bull, where they are seen to come from in the sky. Both Enki and the Taurids are believed to be remnants of a much larger comet, which has disintegrated over the past 20,000 to 30,000 years, breaking into several pieces and releasing material, some of which is likely to have affected the Earth. The stream of matter is largest in the inner solar system, and tidal forces from the Earth could have caused the fragments to break up further. Earth takes several weeks to pass through the meteor swarm, and although today we only experience dust grains and pebbles, in the not too distant past this was probably very different. From South America to Egypt and beyond, the ancients were great astronomers, and there was an obvious understanding of the heavens. It is no coincidence that the Mayan and the Indian calendars had similar start dates, and maybe they both began with a major astronomical event. The meteor swarm could have also increased the amount of volcanology on the planet, as seen by the ice core data from Greenland. Frequent eruptions would have produced dust that settled in the atmosphere, cooling down temperatures worldwide. Such volcanic dust affects climate unevenly, lowering temperatures at high latitudes more than the tropics. These cooler temperatures in the north may have started human migrations, which, in turn, disrupted established settlements in the lower latitudes. The changes and emerging powers we see at this time in Sumer and Egypt may not have been from the evolution of the local population, but from an outside influence, a more advanced culture settling in new territories, whether taking land peacefully or by force. Ancient Egypt didn't become the power it was until dynastic history began, and dynastic history began around 3100 BC, the same time as the global changes. I am of the opinion that Earth was more strongly affected in the past by the Taurid meteor swarm from the breakup of Comet Enki, which did cause more violent impacts or Tunguska-style explosions across the world, a frightening annual event. It probably did lead to an increase in volcanic activity, and for many years the Earth was a volatile place to live. In the past, I've speculated that the ancient cave systems of the world, as well as many of the ancient megalithic sites, were probably built because of the Younger Dryas event, which is certainly true regarding Göbekli Tepe, a site that is radiocarbon dated to be from that era. But currently, the more I read and the more I hypothesize, the more I think that most of the structures, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, are actually a result of the natural phenomena experienced between 3500 and 3000 BC. Maybe the cave systems were actually dug out and used annually when the Earth passed through the Taurid meteor swarm, almost like an ancient bomb shelter. Nobody knew where the fragments would land, nobody knew where they would be safe, and so for several weeks of every year, humanity went underground. As stated, radiocarbon dates from the organic material found between the masonry blocks of the Great Pyramid propose a construction date between 3100 and 3000 BC. This infers that they were built at a time of global instability, and due to the Giza Pyramid's complexity and scale, it is highly likely that they offered some kind of solution to large-scale problems experienced by the population. If we knew when the Giza Pyramids were actually built, then it would be easier to hypothesize as to what their function was, as opposed to studying the structure first, trying to guess its function, and then trying to fit it into a historical narrative, which is the case now with the bogus, yet universally accepted, Khufu tomb interpretation. So how did the 5,000-year-old meteor swarm and associated climatic changes affect ancient Egypt? Well, it is interesting to learn that in pre-dynastic times, that's pre-3100 BC, there were at least 37 species of large-bodied mammals in Egypt, as recorded in ancient artwork. Since then, only 8 remain today, with animals such as lions, wild dogs, elephants and giraffes all absent. In human memory, Egypt was once a rich and diverse mammalian community, but numbers declined dramatically. Sometime between 3500 and 3000 BC, the African humid period came to an end, and monsoons drifted to the south, as North Africa began to dry out. At the same time, human population densities were rapidly increasing, and competition for space along the Nile Valley would have had a large impact on animal populations. Biologist Justin Yeakel, paleontologist Paul Koch, and zoologist Dale Osborne have documented this on record, and this should really be our starting point when trying to understand the pyramids. The researchers have proven without a doubt that climate has affected Egyptian civilization. There are 3 major climate shifts in Egyptian history. One is before dynastic history, the next coincides with the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and the third coincides with the fall of the New Kingdom. Each climatic change led to major animal migrations, and it's clear that the latter 2 of the 3 events changed human history too. So the first, the African humid period ended relatively abruptly, and was likely caused by meteorites or cometary debris, the global event as outlined in this video. The increase in arid conditions forced societies to improve their organisation in order to optimise natural resources, in particular freshwater supplies. Neolithic communities were forced to concentrate in river valleys and to develop irrigation systems, something that we know that Narmer or Menes introduced into Egypt for the first time. The Sahara Desert went from lush lakes and grasslands with hippos and giraffes to a vast desert. Make no mistake, this was one of the planet's most dramatic climate shifts in history. The African desert was rapidly advancing to the east, and Egypt must have been in turmoil. We can see the huge amount of deserted settlements in western Egypt, such as the famous Nabda Playa, as all populations migrated towards the River Nile. This is the time when radiocarbon dates from the Great Pyramid, as well as from the famous solar boat, assume the Great Pyramid was actually built. If the Great Pyramid was in part a water pump as I hypothesize, then yes, as people have said, there will be no reason to build it thousands of years in the past when Egypt was greener and wetter. You only need an enormous water pump if you need to physically move large volumes of water. People counter this and ask why they needed a water pump when the Nile is right there. Well, simply because the Nile levels were reducing, and populations from all across Egypt were heading to the Nile, no doubt causing unrest and major political problems for cultural leaders. Narmer or Menes introduced irrigation into Egypt for a reason. It was a necessity, and I think that is exactly why it is he who built the Great Pyramid. He needed to stop the desertification of Egypt, and he needed to ensure that populations moved away from the Nile. It was still a Neolithic community. Farmland was of paramount importance, and the land was drying out, an effect of the climatic changes from the meteor swarm. Sure, everybody in Egypt could have moved to the Nile Valley, but this wouldn't have solved all the problems, and the greater population of Egypt was in real danger of reverting back to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, as farmland was quickly vanishing. Like Etana of Kish in Sumer, I believe that Narmer or Menez came from outside of Egypt, whether invited or through conquest, and he offered a solution to a humanitarian crisis like the people of Egypt had never seen before. I've said in the past that I think that he came from Mesopotamia, but this may actually not be the case. Egyptian and Sumerian dynastic history began at roughly the same time, so maybe the same technologically advanced people moved into both lands and took control through their innovations and their knowledge. New and old cultures mixed, and Sumer and Egypt were both different because of this, but they were both more advanced than any other country. Both kingdoms had unique, old traditions, but both, I believe, were taken over by the remnants of a more advanced, now lost civilization, which explains the many differences, but also the many similarities between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. The Narmer palette, which portrays Egypt's first dynastic king, has obvious similarities to Mesopotamian art, and although nobody has ever accurately deciphered its meaning, I believe it commemorates the effects of the meteor swarm of around 3100 BC, a message written in code. I will be making a video on this in the near future. So, are there any major abandoned settlements in the mid-4th millennium BC? Until very recently, nobody knew about Göbekli Tepe or Gunung Padang, the largest and oldest pyramidal structure in the world. And even though both of these sites are too early to be the origin of the pyramid builders, maybe archaeologists are still yet to find their origin. I believe that we are missing a major part of the timeline of human history. Was there really a lost city of Atlantis that fell beneath the waves as Plato surmised, maybe as recently as the 4th millennium BC? If there was, we now know there was a likely event that caused it, and maybe Atlantis really is the true home of the lost ancient civilization. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.